The voice that tore through the damp morning air was amplified by a tinny megaphone, scrubbed clean of all human emotion. It was the voice of pure function. All prisoners, out! Assemble in the yard, now! The women filed out from the long, low-roofed wooden structure they called home. Barrack C. They were former Helferinnen, female auxiliaries of the German armed forces, radio operators, clerks, anti-aircraft spotters. Now, they were simply numbers on a roster. Among them was Ilse Brandt. At 22, she still carried herself with the ramrod posture of her days as a signals operator for the Luftwaffe. Her sharp, intelligent eyes, once alight with fervent belief, were now guarded, scanning the world for threats. They formed ragged lines on the gravel yard. Before them stood two figures. The first was Sergeant Evans, a young Welshman with a heavy jaw and the perpetually uncomfortable look of a man who feels he is in the wrong place at the wrong time. He held the megaphone. The second, standing slightly behind him, was the camp commandant, Major Reginald Davis, a man in his 50s, thin, precise, with a face that seemed carved from granite. He was a man of few words and immense unspoken authority. His presence alone was enough to chill the air. Sergeant Evans cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Attention! Due to confirmed cases of pediculosis and early signs of skin disease within the barracks, a full sanitary delousing of all personnel has been ordered to prevent an epidemic. A nervous murmur rippled through the ranks. They had been through this before. A weekly cold shower under the watchful eyes of female British wardens. Degrading, but a known quantity. But Evans hadn't finished. He took a breath, and his next words dropped like stones into a frozen pond. The facilities in the female barracks are inadequate for the task. The procedure will therefore be conducted in the open air. Over there. He gestured vaguely toward the far end of the yard. There, hastily erected, was a series of pipes fitted with shower heads, perched above wooden duckboards. There were no walls, no curtains, no privacy of any kind. It was a skeletal structure, open to the wind and to any and all eyes. You will proceed in groups of 20. You will strip naked. You will leave your clothing on the benches for fumigation. You will each receive a bar of carbolic soap. After washing, you will be issued clean clothing. The murmur died. The silence that replaced it was absolute, electric with disbelief and horror. The women looked from the naked pipes to the perimeter of the yard, where a contingent of young British soldiers stood guard, rifles slung over their shoulders. Boys, most of them. They shifted their weight, their gazes fixed on the horizon, on their boots, anywhere but on the assembled women. This was it. This was the moment of ultimate debasement they had been taught to expect from the enemy. A calculated, sadistic spectacle, to force them, women of a defeated but proud nation, to expose themselves not just to the elements, but to the gaze of their conquerors. Ilse felt a cold fury rise within her. This was the enemy from the propaganda posters made real, not soldiers, but savages, reveling in their power over the helpless. She braced herself for what was to come. The whistles, the lewd comments, the hungry, predatory stares. She would not cry. She would not flinch. She would meet their depravity with a wall of contempt. First group, 20 prisoners, forward, Evans commanded. The first group, which included a pragmatic, quiet woman named Hannah, was nudged forward by the guards. They walked as if to their own execution. Ilse watched, her heart a cold, heavy knot in her chest. She waited for the jeering to begin. The 20 women stopped by the makeshift showers, huddling together for a pathetic scrap of shared dignity. The male guard stood in a semicircle a mere 10 yards away, facing them directly. The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. And then Sergeant Evans, his face a mask of neutrality, shouted a command that made no sense, a command that broke the logic of the entire grotesque scenario. Convoy, about, turn. With a single, unified crash of boots on gravel, the 20 British soldiers turned as one. They now stood with their backs to the prisoners, a solid, unmoving wall of khaki-clad shoulders. They were staring out, away from the scene as if guarding the women not from escape but from the world itself. For a long moment, no one moved. The prisoners stared at the wall of backs, utterly confounded. Was this a trick? A crueler, more refined form of mockery? The prevailing theory, whispered by a woman near Ilse, was that they would turn around at the last second to catch them at their most vulnerable. "You have 5 minutes," Sergeant Evans's disembodied voice announced. Proceed. The soldiers remained like statues. The wind rustled the fabric of their jackets, but not a single head turned. There was no anticipation in their posture, no hint of a cruel game. There was only duty, a profound, unshakable, and utterly indifferent execution of an order. It was this indifference that began to dismantle Ilsa's defenses. Hatred requires an object, contempt requires engagement. Here, there was a void. The act of being watched and judged, as terrifying as it was, would have at least been a form of recognition. It would have acknowledged them as women, as the enemy, as human beings, capable of feeling shame. But this was different. This was the act of not being seen at all. Hannah was the first to break the spell. With a shrug of grim pragmatism, she began to quickly remove her uniform. Her movements were brisk, mechanical. One by one, hesitantly, the others followed. The air was bitingly cold. As Ilsa's own group was called and the command was repeated, she found herself walking toward the same wall of backs. The fear of being looked at was gone, replaced by a new and stranger dread, the terror of being utterly insignificant. As she stood naked under the gray English sky, she felt a new kind of shame. It was not the shame of her body being seen, but the shame of her very existence being reclassified. She was no longer a person. She was a task, a sanitation problem to be solved with maximum efficiency and minimum fuss. The soldiers' turned backs were not an act of chivalry. They were a procedural measure, a way to ensure that the task, delousing, was completed without the messy, inefficient complication of human interaction. The icy water was a shock, but the real chill was internal. The carbolic soap smelled of hospitals and institutions, the scent of depersonalization. At one point, a young woman slipped on the wet boards, crying out as she fell. Instinctively, one of the youngest soldiers, a boy with freckles, half turned at the sound. His eyes, wide with alarm, met Ilsa's for a fraction of a second. There was no lust in his gaze, no malice, only surprise and a flicker of what looked like pity. He immediately flushed a deep crimson and snapped his head back around as if he had broken a sacred rule. That fleeting human connection made the whole ordeal infinitely worse. It was a momentary crack in the facade, a reminder that they were all people, trapped in a machine that demanded they behave otherwise. The system was designed to erase their humanity, and it was working perfectly. When they were done, their old, lice-infested clothes were gone. In their place were neat piles of clean, threadbare undergarments and fresh gray uniforms. Everything was organized. Everything was efficient. The humiliation of hygiene was complete. They had not been brutalized. They had been processed. The return to the barrack was marked by a profound and heavy silence. Usually, after any event, the room would buzz with whispers, complaint, and speculation. Now, there was nothing. The women, scrubbed clean and dressed in identical anonymous clothing, moved like ghosts. They sat on their bunks and stared at the floorboards, at the walls, at nothing. The event had not broken their bodies, it had broken their narrative. For years they had been fed a consistent story. They were the proud daughters of a great nation, engaged in a righteous struggle against barbaric enemies. Even in defeat and captivity, this narrative provided a framework for their identity. It allowed them to see themselves as martyrs, not criminals. It gave them the right to their hatred, and hatred is a powerful fuel for survival. The sanitary shower had shattered that narrative. The barbaric enemy had failed to perform their expected role. Instead of indulging in primitive cruelty, they had demonstrated a chillingly modern form of power, the power of bureaucratic indifference. They had not treated the prisoners with hatred. They had not treated them with anything at all. They had simply managed them. The deepest insult was a discovery that their grand, tragic story of national struggle was, to their captors, an irrelevant footnote. Their identity as German women, their pride, their sacrifice, all of it was less important than a louse. Lotta, a girl of 19 from Dresden, became the focal point of this collective collapse. For days, she said nothing. Then one evening, she spoke to Ilsa, her voice a monotone whisper. "My father was a professor of philosophy," she said, her eyes vacant. "He spoke of the German Geist, the spirit. He said it was our unique gift to the world, that our spirit could never be broken." She paused, looking at her hands. They turned their backs, not out of respect, but because our spirits, our shame, it wasn't on their checklist. We were just livestock, to be washed. It's also stupid, everything he said. All of it. Lotta's words articulated the unspoken horror that had settled over the barrack. It was the existential shame of realizing your entire worldview was a provincial delusion. The shame of discovering that in the grand, objective calculus of the victors, you were not even a worthy adversary, just a line item in a hygiene report. The silence in Barrack C was the sound of 100 worlds imploding at once. A few days later, Sergeant Evans entered the barrack with several soldiers carrying crates. "From the Red Cross," he announced to the room, not making eye contact with anyone. "Major's orders. For morale." He set down the crates and left. They were filled with books, worn English paperbacks. Shakespeare, Dickens, Jane Austen. Ilsa picked one up. Pride and Prejudice. It was another calculated act in this theater of the absurd. First, you sterilize their bodies. Then, you provide them with literature. It was all part of the same detached, orderly process of managing captured personnel. It wasn't kindness, it was protocol. The shock in Ilsa eventually cooled into a sharp, analytical curiosity. She had to understand the mind behind the action. She began to watch Major Davis on his rare inspections. He moved with an air of clinical detachment, his eyes missing nothing, from a loose floorboard to a dirty window pane. He was not a warrior. He was an administrator. The opportunity for an answer came unexpectedly. Ilsa's group was assigned to a work detail, repairing a stretch of the perimeter fence. Sergeant Evans was their guard. During a lull in the work, Ilsa approached him. "Sergeant," she began, her English halting but clear, "I must ask. That day, the showers. Why did you turn away?" Evans looked deeply uncomfortable. He finished his cigarette and carefully pocketed the butt. "Orders are orders." "Not that order," Ilsa pressed. "The other one. The order to turn." He sighed, a long, weary breath. He glanced around to ensure no one else was listening. "Look," he said, his voice low, "you've got the Major all wrong. He's not what you think." He explained that Major Davis, before the war, had been a colonial administrator in India. He was obsessed with sanitation and the prevention of disease, but the defining moment had come just months before, in April 1945. His unit was one of the first into Bergen-Belsen, Evans said quietly. The name hung in the air. By now, pictures and reports from the liberated concentration camps had filtered into the POW network. They had seemed like fantastical propaganda. Now, hearing it from this soldier, Ilsa felt a cold certainty of their truth. "He spent 2 weeks there," Evans continued, "organizing the quarantine. He saw the typhus, the dysentery, the piles of bodies. He told us he can still smell it. He swore that no camp under his command would ever fall to disease. When lice were found in your barrack, he nearly lost his mind." The pieces began to fall into a bizarre, horrifying new pattern. The open-air showers were his idea for quick mass treatment. When he gave the order, one of the junior officers smirked and said something about getting a free show. Evans shook his head. The Major's face went white. He turned to the lieutenant and said, very quietly, "This is not a show. This is a public health measure. We are His Majesty's soldiers, not zookeepers. The convoy will face away, so that no man is tempted to confuse his duty with entertainment. Is that clear?" Ilsa stood motionless, the coil of wire heavy in her hand. There was no sadistic plot. There was no grand psychological strategy. There was only one man's traumatic memory of Belsen, his fanatical devotion to hygiene, and his own rigid, almost Victorian code of conduct. He had ordered them to turn their backs not to spare the women's dignity, but to preserve his own soldiers' discipline. The women's shame was an unfortunate but irrelevant byproduct of a necessary procedure. It wasn't personal. That unspoken phrase echoed in Ilsa's mind, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that this was the final, absolute defeat. To have your entire existence, your suffering, your very identity deemed not even worthy of your enemy's hatred. Ilsa Brandt was repatriated in 1947. The ideological fervor of her youth was gone, scoured away as surely as the dirt in that English yard. She trained as a nurse, dedicating her life to the methodical, impersonal, and efficient care of the sick. She became legendary in her hospital for her almost fanatical obsession with hygiene and her cool, detached professionalism. She treated bodies, not people, seeing each patient as a problem to be solved. She never married. She had, in a strange and terrible way, become Major Davis. Major Reginald Davis retired a colonel. In his published memoirs, Order from Chaos, An Administrator's War, the incident at Ashdown is mentioned in a single, sanitized sentence in a chapter on camp logistics. Through timely implementation of broad public health measures, including a full delousing of the female auxiliary contingent, a potential typhus outbreak was successfully averted with 0 disciplinary infractions recorded among the supervising personnel. Lotte, the girl from Dresden, spent several years in a sanatorium. Her spirit, the one her father had so prized, had been broken not by violence but by absurdity. She lived out her days as a quiet piano tuner, finding solace in a world of predictable, mathematical harmony, far from the chaotic illogic of human affairs. The event at Ashdown was never recorded as an atrocity. It was, by all official metrics, a success. But for the women of Barrack C, the wall of backs remained the defining image of their war. It was not a wall that hid them from view. It was a mirror reflecting a chilling modern truth. The most devastating power is not the one that seeks to crush your body, but the one that doesn't even acknowledge your soul.